Collision is when enemies are limited to one enemy per cell. The enemies on the right are stacked on top of each other. They do not have collision. The enemies on the left are not stacked. They do have collision. The executive summary for activating collision is to either have a turret, unpowered works just fine, in its own little room with a closed door, or have a small collision chamber with one closed door facing the enemy. When you want collision, put a pawn in the collision chamber. When you don't want collision, leave the chamber empty. How close does a collision generating turret need to be to the entrance to your defenses? How far away from the turret or collision chamber is collision going to be generated? There is no simple answer to these questions. We will dig into the mechanics of collision, and it is going to be crazy complicated. The turret should be as close to the entrance as you can manage. One closed door is great. Have the closed door be facing the entrance. Fire can diagonally go through the gap, so it's often best to full square wall off the turret. Here's a few setups that surely work just fine. As you go further away from the entrance, it is still probably just fine, but there may be crazy circumstances that make it not work properly. How long does collision last? We don't know the exact time frame. If you have a long maze or tunnel, add another collision generating turret or chamber later on. Why did my melee block get pushed back? Doors, even open doors, can restrict collision. If you know you are going to be melee blocking somewhere, deconstruct open doors temporarily and rebuild them after the fight. One open door is probably just fine. Door, gap, door is potentially bad. More doors is almost certainly bad. Here's melee blocking at door, gap, door. This will sometimes, but not always, cause the pushback problem. Here's melee blocking at the same position with the doors gone. This will virtually always create collision on the other side and prevent pushback. Why didn't collision work in my setup? There are a few unintuitive reasons collision won't work. Pathable powered turrets. Do not have a pathable powered turret. If you do want to use turrets, turn them off until the enemy gets collision, then turn them on. Breachers and sappers cannot be given collision. Fleeing enemies, no collision. Mech boss waves from the Biotech DLC, no collision. There are more potential reasons why. Let's get into the complicated mechanics of collision. Collision happens when a pawn is in combat mode and near an enemy combatant. Those are three separate concepts that all need to be met. Combat mode, near, enemy combatant. Enemy combatant is the easiest of the three to understand. Enemy means they need to be from a hostile faction. Could be enemy factions, mechs, insects, manhunting animals, those all fit. A pawn from a neutral or allied faction would not satisfy the condition. Combatant is any of these pictured here, and possibly a few more. Here's a text list of enemy combatants, and I probably missed a few things. Near is more complicated. For collision, near means within the 18 nearest connected map regions. Connected mostly means not through walls. Connected can be joined by open spaces, barricades, fences, and doors. It does not matter if the doors are closed or open. For the purposes of collision, these two setups are exactly the same. You can view the map regions by turning on development mode. Hit the third button at the top, which is open the view settings, and it takes you to this settings tab. Use the search box in the upper left, type region, and check draw regions. Map regions are hidden 12 by 12 sections of the map that start from the lower left corner. And they are any space enclosed by walls, doors, fences, animal flaps, and barricades, not sandbags. Essentially, anything that creates a room or creates an animal pen. Barricades block animals and create pens and act like a fence. Sandbags do not make pens. Each pawn checks its nearest 18 connected regions. Why 18? I don't know. That's just the number it says in the Rimworld code. How does it work with complicated shapes and room sizes? I don't know. If someone's able to break down the exact method, I'll try to put a link to their explanation in the description. Combat mode. We don't know the exact meaning of combat mode, but we do know a few reasons enemies can be in movement mode. If the enemy is in movement mode, they will not get collision. Powered turret. Ranged enemies targeting a powered turret go into movement mode to attack the turret. Melee enemies are unaffected. If you have a pathable powered turret anywhere in your base, either turn it off until enemies arrive or somehow make it unpathable. Enemies running towards cover. This counts as movement. These enemies in this example are trying to get to cover, which is why they don't have collision. Enemies in follow mode behind sappers or breachers. They're following the leader. They're not in combat mode. Enemies in follow mode behind a mech boss. This is from the Biotech DLC. The enemies following the mech boss in a mech boss wave will not have collision. Fleeing enemies. They're trying to flee. They're not in combat. That means they don't get collision. The initial step of a prison break. They're trying to break out of prison. They're not in combat. Won't get collision. Enemies on fire. Enemies that are lit on fire don't get collision. This is why you may not want to use things like Molotov cocktails and plasma swords against insects or other melee enemies. You can light them on fire and they'll run right through your melee block into your base and potentially light your base on fire. Collision is affected by body size. Insect megascarabs, rats, and some other small animals can stack on top of each other and squeeze through some gaps even with collision being generated. Collision rules apply to your colonists as well. Tell all your colonists to punch an enemy on the other side of the door. They are near an enemy combatant and in combat mode. They get collision. Tell all your colonists to move next to an enemy on the other side of a door. That's movement mode, not combat mode. No collision. They can all stack on top of each other through the door. If you need to move your melee fighters through your ranged fighters, remember to use the movement command so you can remove collision and pass through. Let's go over what we learned and add a few more details in some places. The simplest way to activate collision is with an unpowered turret with a closed door. Place the turret as close as possible to where you want collision. Fully wall around the turret to prevent diagonal jumping fires. Alternatively, make a collision chamber. When you want collision, place a pawn in this chamber. When you do not want collision, leave the chamber empty. This setup can be great if you have a path that leads to both a burn box and a kill box. Sometimes you may want collision and sometimes you may not want collision. The chamber lets you choose if you do or do not generate collision. If the chamber is empty and collision is still generated, restrict collision by adding another chamber next to the first, and replace any nearby outer doors with walls. Open doors, fences, and barricades can restrict how far collision generates. If you try to melee block behind several of those, you may get pushed back. Temporarily destroy open doors if you intend on melee blocking behind them. Rebuild them after the fight. Why didn't collision generate in my setup? The most common reason is a pathable powered turret. That turret can be anywhere pathable in your base, even comically far away. Here's the list of some other reasons collision may not generate. Pause or go back to check these out again. Collision mechanics is roughly in combat mode and near an enemy combatant. Those are three separate concepts. Combat mode, near, enemy combatant. Head back earlier in the video or check the description for more details on any of those. Collision also applies to your colonists. Attack command creates collision and prevents your colonists from walking through each other. Movement commands prevent collision and allows you to walk over your own colonists. I'm Mortal Smurf. That's the most practical breakdown of collision I can make in a reasonable amount of time. There will be more info in the text in the description, and I hopefully will update things as I learn more. Thanks for watching.